Risk takers and failures and losers. Who among of us has not been these at some point, right? You know that quote? I'm taking this off here. Okay, you know that quote, life's a stage, we're all performers. You know that quote? Who said that? Was it William Shakespeare? There's also life isn't a dress rehearsal. No idea who came up with that. But I want to say these are both statements that I vehemently disagree with. They kind of get into your brain and tell you that everything just has to be just so in your life, a performance, no mistakes, like you might have in your dress rehearsal. You are putting this on your life, a stage of performance. Mistakes, failures are not allowed. Except we know, if you've ever been in a stage production, that mistakes happen. You cough or you sneeze at the wrong time, you hit the wrong note, you forget your lines, you miss your cue. Your costume change doesn't go fast enough. If life's a performance and not a dress rehearsal, then your mistakes are that much more public, it seems. I have some experience with this. When I was 12, I was cast in my school's production of Peter Pan. I was one of the lost boys, curly, which I truly don't understand because I've always had straight hair. And there were about 6 of us who were cast in these roles. And I didn't have very many lines, which was probably good. Mostly, I remember having a lot of fun doing the stage fighting with the pirates. But one thing that I remember the director saying was that you might forget your lines. And all of us lost boys could step in for someone else, so they did. So one performance, I remember sitting there, I think we were maybe sitting around Peter Pan's unconscious body. And I don't remember all the details. And there was a moment of silence and I was just absorbed in the moment, right? Somebody had forgotten their lines. After a couple of seconds, a girl in my class who was playing a different lost boy began speaking. She looked out into the distance and talked about noticing something. And as she spoke, I realized that was my line that I had forgotten. Now, there was a part of me that was a little annoyed. I don't have that many lines and she just took one. But really, if she hadn't, who knows how long we could have been sitting there in silence on the stage. So I'm actually very grateful for her for knowing my line well enough to paraphrase it. She did something a little brave. She spoke a line when it wasn't hers to help catch all of us. And when I remember that moment, I'm struck by the feeling of not being alone, of knowing that we can hold each other. Now, nobody chastised me after this mistake for forgetting my line. Our production of Peter Pan was not an Otto O'Connor as Curly production, so it wasn't even a production about Peter Pan or the person who played him. It was about us acting together, holding each other even when we made mistakes. And you better believe that I didn't miss my cue the next performance, at least not that cue. And so it's important for us to remember, right? Performance is practice too. What do I mean by that? Well, so much of what we do is about practicing for the next time we do it. Each time we begin learning a new skill, we begin as beginners. By definition, bad at it, right? Nobody knows how to ride a bicycle the first time we try. Nobody knows how to do math or calculus without instruction and practice. And the first day on a new job, even if it's your field of expertise, it usually involves some orientation, getting to know the place you're working, practicing your craft or the skills of being around other people. The first time you came to this church, for example, you were tentative. You didn't know what order things came in, or if you should sit or stand, or what was expected of you at coffee hour. And so you practice. You're practicing now. What does it mean to be in community? It's the job of the rest of us to notice when you miss a cue and support you in that, help you out. Okay, another story I have about this. I recently started, or I should say re-engaged with a practice that I used to do before the pandemic, the practice of yoga. As I entered the studio for the first time, palms sweaty, concerned about how my yoga clothes looked. Is this appropriate? Will I be able to move enough? What do men even wear to yoga? I felt this familiar sense of inadequacy. I knew that my muscles had probably atrophied since I last engaged with this practice, not that I had ever been particularly good at it. Nonetheless, after several false starts, when I came up with some excuse for not going to class, I presented myself there with my mat and my probably insufficient yoga clothes to start practicing yoga. So I go in the middle of the day when there were only about 3 people in class with me, and I set about making sure that I hold every plank as long as possible, never take a modification on my poses, don't let on that my muscles are burning, hope nobody else sees me shaking, and comforted myself when I couldn't twist myself in a pretzel because men are naturally less bendy, right? So in short, I was trying to perform my practice for the 3 other people in the class. Friends, I don't recommend doing this. After trying this for a few weeks, I ended up with a pretty bad pain in my right elbow. And I showed up for another class despite the pain, and I happened to be the only one attending. Because of that, the instructor asked me if there was anything I wanted to focus on, and reluctantly, I told her about my arm. My arm hurts right here, I said, timidly, afraid of showing my weakness a little. And she then, generously, though I suppose it is her job, showed me a bunch of modifications I could do to still do yoga while I helped my body heal. The next class I went to was a group, and I, somewhat intimidated by the idea of actually taking these modifications, did things like stay in child's pose or bend my knees during plank. Plank is, I should say, is sort of like a push-up that you just hold. And I just took it easy, even though I assumed everyone was looking at me and thought that I was weak. If you're starting to wonder if I'm missing the point of something called practice, then you're right. I like getting exercise, and I have trouble with gyms because I can't stop focusing on myself and how I'm doing it wrong. Not running as much or as long as that person next to me, not lifting weights correctly or as much as someone else. The competition feels really intense to me, which I think is why I like yoga so much. At its best, it's considered a practice. Some, myself included, might even consider a spiritual practice. And the thing about practice is when you practice, you aren't good at it yet. When you practice, you get better. But sometimes we focus more on that getting better part than the end goal, that perfection part of ourselves, which means that sometimes it's hard to begin a practice at all. And then once we start doing something, we rush to get good at it, to do better, and even to make money at it. I know I was raised in a culture where to be good at something meant figuring out how to get money to do it. Hustle culture, right? That's the idea that folks, particularly recently, have found that we must work every day to make money. And there's, of course, this concept of a side hustle. If you're good at yoga, for example, have a side hustle teaching yoga. If you're good at web design, have a side hustle doing web design. If you like painting or making music or whatever, you have to get good at it so you can make money doing it. And I think we're so focused on this idea of onward and upwards that it's hard for us to be simply present in practicing for the sake of practicing. Practice is a funny word, right? We use it to mean all sorts of things. You practice an instrument when you prepare for a performance. Yet for many skills, to practice is literally to perform the skill, such as the practice of yoga, but also any spiritual practices, such as praying, meditating. The practice is also used in highly skilled professions like doctors and therapists and lawyers. They talk about opening up their own practice. And yikes, when I hear this, I think they cannot be practicing on me. This is life or death. They better get it right. But that's just the thing, isn't it? Within these names of how these professions are used, we are confronted with the idea that they are just that, a practice. In the book Brain on Fire by Susanna Cahalan, that documents her experience with a very sudden symptoms of sickness and outbursts and seizures, a woman ends up going to this series of doctors, many of whom tell her that it's just a mental health concern causing this. Until one doctor, one very experienced doctor, I might add, one with a lot of practice, figures out that it's an inflammation in half of her brain that would have killed her if they hadn't caught it. All of them, including that doctor, were practicing. They had to practice to learn that this was a thing to look for, gaining new skills each time they do something, an ever-evolving practice. Okay, so we've established that everything is a practice. The practice is something that we all do, and a practice means that we are inherently not doing it perfectly, and that life is a series of practices. So what does that mean for us collectively? Well, being here right now, online or in person, is a practice. Is a practice in the spiritual sense to show up on Sunday morning, to take your seat in a pew or in front of a computer. Many of you probably felt the same way I did when I first went to yoga, when you first came here, nervous with a few failed starts. But it's a practice to show up every week, to be confronted with whatever it is we're talking about, be it grief or sorrow, theology, social justice, and principles. Each time you come here, you are expected to practice something, even when you don't get it right, which you inevitably won't. We hold you and we make space for you here. That's what we're about. When we come here, we practice welcoming others and being welcomed. We practice being vulnerable with others when we share joys and concerns. We practice getting people's pronouns right or sharing our own pronouns, even when it doesn't feel natural. We practice what it feels like to hear, see, or sing something that doesn't resonate with us. We practice being open to something moving us that we didn't expect. We practice stillness. We practice prayer. We practice making coffee, making name tags, remembering each other's names. We practice singing. We practice speaking. We practice being the people we want to be. We practice abundance. We practice letting go. We practice accepting change. We practice grieving. We practice tolerating people we don't necessarily like. We practice apologies. We practice presence. We practice not telling children to be quiet. We practice acceptance of others. We practice having hard conversations. We practice. And when you come here, you don't practice because you expect you will always be able to get better and to be perfect. You don't sing in the choir because you expect to someday be a famous vocalist, I think. You don't practice coffee because you aspire to be a barista. You practice because that is what church is about. Going to church is a spiritual practice. And the thing about practicing is that you are allowed to get it wrong. And I'm going to say it again, you are allowed to get it wrong. You are allowed, no, expected not to do it perfectly. But you are expected to practice for the sake of practicing. Something I know is a struggle for many people, especially folks who come into our community from a more dominant cultural background or narrative, worry sometimes about saying the wrong thing or concerned that an idea might offend someone. I hear this a lot, but I want to say to you to practice saying things and hearing other perspectives. At my next yoga class, after this first one, I did all of these modified positions and I felt embarrassed, but it was good for me because I needed to practice that and I was held in that and my body thanked me. So too will your body and your church thank you when you take time to practice what it means to be here. Here's something I think about each week, right? So I come here each week and I preach, sometimes on sensitive subjects. And that means I worry about what I'm going to say, unintentionally saying something stupid that discounts someone's experience, that contributes to the impression of someone else, that offends someone. And sometimes that makes me feel like I don't want to talk about difficult topics like race and white supremacy and capitalism and war and sexuality and et cetera, et cetera. But I always tell myself that this is practice. I need to practice for the next time I talk about these things. And that it's better to address them than to say nothing at all. And part of that practice means putting myself out there, knowing that I will fail, and allowing that to be part of the practice. Because what is practice if not allowing ourselves the space to be imperfect, the space to make mistakes, in the service of doing just a tiny bit better? One of the pieces of our mission statement is that we take risks for justice. What does it look like to do this? Is taking risks a muscle we need to develop? Can we practice things as a community? Right? As we practice coming back from COVID, we are practicing again what it means to be in community. And that means that sometimes we will mess it up. So I suppose my message to you here today is that sometimes you need to try things that you won't be good at and you might never be good at. This isn't a performance. This is practice. Give yourself grace, receive grace, to be gentle with yourself when you fall in the mud, and to practice not because you ever expect mastery, but precisely because you don't. Everything we do is the practice for the next time we do it, Remember that. And remember that we will help you when you forget your cue. May it be so. And let us say together, Amen. Amen. Now is our time in our service where we celebrate and share the gifts of our community. Today's offering is going to be shared with the United American Indians of New England in honor of this month's Indigenous People Day. The